So one of the things that came up in the last panel is we began to talk near the end about the notion that because of the shift in delivery models or shift in business models, depending on how you want to look at it, that those shifts themselves are actually creating new opportunities for value and creating hurdles for old definitions of value. And we actually have a whole panel on this, which we didn't even know, we didn't plan that, but is now teed up to be right here next. And so here to moderate this panel is Nina Baines, who's a partner at Kilpatrick, Townsend, and Stockton LLP. I am not that Kilpatrick, but I am sure they are also brilliant. So Nina, come on up here, and just kidding.
Thanks,
And take us through this discussion.
Great. Wow, it's bright up here. It's my pleasure to moderate this impressive panel on creating value with business innovations in medtech. As the delivery and payment for healthcare changes to a landscape to one where value is rewarded, our industry must change with it to survive and even to thrive. In recent news, in the headlines, we continue to hear of vertical integrations. For example, Medtronic recently this quarter acquired Cardiocom for $200 million, a telehealth and patient service company for chronic diseases, and launched Hospitals Solutions business, signaling a business model beyond devices and into healthcare services and solutions. Bayer also recently expanded its birth control business with the $1.1 billion acquisition of Conceptus, signaling pharma's continued interest in medical devices, and particularly minimally invasive devices. Our objective over the next hour is to share some thinking about the types of business innovations and strategic solutions that are creating value for those in the healthcare ecosystem that interact with our products. In particular, we will be hearing from small, early-stage revenue-generating companies and the opportunities they have to change the paradigm of our healthcare industry. I'll start all the way down at the far end of my table with Judy, who we just heard. Judy Linnane is the Chief Clinical Officer and Executive Vice President of Operations at iRhythm, a medtech service company developing innovative diagnostic products in the cardiac space. Judy is a veteran to the startup space, responsible for creating 4 other successful cardiovascular companies, and prior to iRhythm, served as the Vice President of Business Development for Centura Health, Colorado's largest healthcare system. Right next to Judy, we have Diane Kay, and Diane is currently Chief Revenue Officer for Mapless, which officially changed its name today to Propeller Health, right?
Correct.
A startup developing novel sensor-based technologies in the asthma and COPD space. Previously, Diane served as head of product strategy and business development during her 10-year tenure at Athena Health, a leading revenue cycle management and electronic medical records company. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Jo Carroll Hyatt to provide her perspective as a physician, provider, and a payer, having been with Kaiser Permanente since 1984. Dr. Hyatt currently is the chair of the National Product Council and also chairs the Interregional New Technologies Committee. She is a partner in the Southern California Permanente Medical Group, the director of clinical trials, and the assistant medical director of business management. She wears a lot of roles. Alex Chung, unfortunately, won't be able to join us today due to an emergency last week. However, I'm happy to report that everything is okay. So there are several types of innovations we heard today that amplify value for the various stakeholders. And we're going to kick off our discussion by how we can create value for the patient, as clearly the patient as a consumer is clearly on the rise in healthcare. So for folks in the audience, by a show of hands, how many of you are part of commercial organizations? Okay, that's a good amount. How many of you are currently marketing directly to patient consumers? A little less. And how many of you are engaging consumer patients beyond the sales channel? Okay. So, Dr. Hyatt, having worked in the various roles in healthcare for the last 30 years, how does a consumer focus benefit the healthcare system?
So I'm not dodging the question, but Nina did ask me to start with a very quick recap about Kaiser Permanente. There may be some people in the audience that aren't particularly familiar with it, especially those that don't live in California. So KP is an integrated delivery system. It's basically an ACO that was founded in the 1930s, long history. And as I mentioned to Nina, if ACOs were really the answer to every problem in the cost of healthcare today, Kaiser would be a whole lot cheaper than we are. We're not all that inexpensive, and I'm sorry to say that, but I just don't think every problem is going to be solved with ACOs. The organization is predominantly in California for its membership. We have well over 9 million members, almost 6.5 million in California, but we also have significant membership in Colorado, the Mid-Atlantic area around Washington, D.C., around Atlanta, Georgia, the Northwest region, which is largely Portland area, Hawaii. So we are in other regions. We've recently sold our Ohio organization, and that's actually being integrated into a local company that's going to, I think, be more successful than we were there. So that's in process at this time. The organization, the hospital and health plan organizations, are a single legal entity across the country. And they are not for profit. The medical groups in each of those regions are actually completely independent and have exclusive contracts in each region. And Northern and Southern California are two different medical groups, as you may have heard in Nina's comment. I'm a partner in the Southern California group. And we have, just as I said, an exclusive relationship. Our physicians are all on salary. Nobody's getting paid fee for service. So it's kind of a different approach. The consumer approach is something that Kaiser has actually had since its very inception. And the concept when it was created was that it was truly out in the desert in Fontana area in Southern California when Henry Kaiser had a lot of employees there who were processing and making the concrete for the Hoover Dam and also the steel mill in the area, and there was a general surgeon in that area who was unable to care for a lot of the injured employees because they didn't have enough money, and he approached Henry Kaiser and said, well, for a nickel a week for each of your employees, I'll just do everything. And that was the beginning. We're a little bit more than a nickel a week now, but that's always been the culture, is that for some prepaid amount, stop worrying about filing claims or doing any of that stuff. We will just take care of you. And I appreciate the comments from the last panel around Kaiser's approach and thinking around cost. We actually look at cost very differently. We think of it as value and do have a longer view. There's a fundamental assumption that if we can improve quality, that reducing costs somewhere, someday will follow, and we aren't necessarily looking for documentation of the cost piece when we make decisions about what to do. In terms of the consumer value, I think we've really grown to appreciate that consumers are not all that interested in health care. They want health. And part of that is to actually, if in an ideal world, not even see us wherever possible. And I think it's somewhat counter to what much of medical care in this country is, because the reimbursement model for physicians and most providers, there has to be an in-person, in-facility encounter and a bill generated and payment. Whereas for KP, if people never need to come in, that's fine with us. So I think we do have a different approach there, and I think the real value for us, for consumers, is finding ways that they can take care of themselves wherever possible without ever coming into our facilities and get care themselves at home.
Thank you. Diane and Judy, as early revenue generating companies in the med tech service space, what type of partnerships or services have you considered or are considering on consumer engagement?
Go. Well, let me take I'll take 2 minutes just to explain what we do, and that will then sort of imply how the consumer is directly, obviously, involved. So this is just to show you a sensor that is attached to inhaled medications. We manufacture these sensors that monitor when people have used their medication, time, date of use of medications. And the data are transmitted to our servers from the sensors either via a smartphone or via a Qualcomm 2net hub. So we're sort of bridging medical devices and sensor technology with mobile apps and mobile devices. So what we do is take that information, collect other information like air quality information, et cetera, as we bridge that through the smartphone, and we communicate back to patients and their families and clinicians, or in the case of a payer, perhaps a case manager, how well patients are doing, how well, for example, with asthma, how well their asthma is controlled, tips and tricks on things they could be doing to improve their own self-management, and also monitoring their adherence to their daily controller therapies to encourage adherence to things that reduce exacerbations and thereby ED visits and hospitalizations. So we were Asthmapolis, focused entirely on asthma, and now we have moved into COPD as well, another respiratory illness, and thus the name change to Propeller Health. Given as an early stage company, it was a little confining when people heard COPD and Asthmapolis, but similarly using the same platform to provide early indication to clinicians or case managers that someone is declined based on their home use of their medications. So in terms of what we do, is the way we think about it, it is great to collect information that's never been collected before, but the information, the data is only valuable if someone uses it to create change, whether that's a clinician that has information they didn't have before to modify a treatment plan, or in the case of self-management, which we're really motivating consumers and patients to understand more about their own diseases, to take actions and do things differently. So as we sell it, sort of a two-level thing, how can you motivate a third party to pay for it, but then also how do you engage a consumer to use information insight, and how do you keep them engaged when there's diverse populations we're supporting?
Great. Thanks, Diane. Since Diane had a show and tell, I thought I would do show and tell also. But to really focus on, and again, iRhythm Technology has created a way to actually collect data over 14 days. And it's cardiac data, and so you place a device on your chest, and you can go about living your life in the normal manner. You can shower with it, you can moderately exercise, and it continues to record, and you really don't do anything else with it. You place it on there, and then you, the patient, takes it off. And what we have found is that patients get it, they understand what to do, they return the devices back to us, and when we look at the data, 98% of the wear time, the device is physically on their body collecting data. That is unheard of in a diagnostic space. It doesn't happen, and we've been able to do this. But we've engaged the patients and help us redesign this. I'm holding, and this is our new version that we just released last week, and it really has been redesigned because of patient input. The patients tell us, 42% of every patient who use our product give us feedback about their experience and what we can do better with the device. And so we redesigned this to make the patient interface much better, and it's been fantastic. Again, we're not out, we're kind of a stealth company. We don't have a big presence in the media yet, but we're hoping to, or the internet and all that, but we really have tried to engage the patient in what really happens, and our patient satisfaction scores show us that. And then what we've seen is that the physicians like it because they don't get complaints from patients. And normally in cardiac diagnostics, most patients complain about the type of monitoring the devices that they have to use. So
that's fantastic. For years we have been focused on the physician and how does the device or service now get in front of the patient. So maybe Diane, you can speak to this, or Dr. Hyatt from your experiences.
So there is a lot of direct advertising. I think that, within the KP world, we are fairly regularly approached by device companies, and often it's a patient bringing something in. But media coverage is certainly one way that we learn of things. I really haven't seen the other side of how a device company would want to approach that.
Right. So I can talk a little bit about sort of our model and how we get to consumers. Right now, we're not selling over the counter, so we sell through third parties, and people say, well, you're targeting payers or you're targeting physicians, health systems, how do you think about it? And sort of having worked on the sort of the in this market for a long time, and it is a really interesting time. What I say is we're looking for people that have both clinical and economic interest. So in some cases, that's the payer and insurance company. In some cases, it is an ACO or an at-risk provider organization or health system. In some cases, but limited, it could be, we're talking with a nationally based allergy group with 100 allergists who's looking to actually reinvent how sort of allergists are viewed within the system and create different models of care as well. But essentially, we sell to those third parties. We're not directly reimbursed, but we sell as programs. So one of the things that we think about, how can you be a substitute for something that's already paid for? So we're a substitute for historic disease management programs, let's say for asthma education. For COPD, there's lots of remote monitoring right now that's being paid for by hospitals, by health systems. Our goal is to sort of suggest that this should be paid for so that people can avoid costs by understanding deterioration before people end up in an ED or a hospital. So our entire sale really, there's not a conversation that happens that isn't about sort of the metrics and the downstream cost avoidance, since that's what we're asking people really to pay for, improved quality, but with that, the downstream cost avoidance.
Great. Another continuing theme in medtech space is reimbursement from our last panel and how to demonstrate value to providers and payers alike. Again, for folks in the audience, by a show of hands, at what stage in your commercial organization did you significantly start investing in reimbursement resources? At the beginning of product development? 12 months before anticipated approval or clearance? At launch? Anyone brave enough to raise their hand? Diane, what type of mutually beneficial alliances or pathways should companies be exploring? And maybe if you could provide some examples of successful partnering by Propeller Health.
Sure. Just going back to that in the show of hands in terms of, when we started commercializing, thinking about our business model. So I actually came on board as a consultant to Propeller Health, really to help them think about that about 3 or 4 months in advance of them receiving their FDA clearance. So they had been very thoughtful in their clinical trials about including economic evidence and getting payers' claims data to understand not only how well we could improve asthma control, but also looking at the downstream economic events. But as we received our FDA clearance, those data were not yet available, but we did start selling. So I think it was sort of in advance of FDA clearance, building the economic case, but then really thinking thoughtfully about who the players were in the market and where to go first, second, and third in terms of seeking reimbursement. And parse that who has the money and who typically is an early adopter of these types of technologies. For example, some payers are and some payers aren't. Similarly, for example, we have a program in Kaiser here in Northern California, typically an early adopter of new innovation. But I think in terms of partnering and thinking about who the players are, I think as an early company, certainly having name brands, if you can and get them, to buy in is helpful, because when someone now hears that Kaiser has a program or AmeriGroup has a program or Sharp-Reed-Steele Medical Group, it gives us some instant credibility. So that's helpful. But I think also thinking about mid-market players, so health systems we think about that are mid-tier, not the big academic medical centers, not the largest payers nationally, because those are long hurdles and longer sales cycles than maybe a really interesting mid-tier player in a mid-market state, where we can capture share and sales faster and then leverage that in terms of producing more evidence to then go into sort of broader markets and players.
Thanks.
So if I could add a little bit there, and thanks, Diana. We do try, and where there does appear to be a very promising technology, bring it in early. And an advantage that we have is that we don't really care about the reimbursement code. It's not relevant to us. So it's potentially an opportunity to trial something in a clinical setting without necessarily having that available, whereas other systems may not be able to do that. And because our physicians are on salary, as are the staff, et cetera, it's less of a problem in terms of worrying about people who are concerned that their billings are going to go down because they're spending more time doing whatever it is for your device. On the other hand, it's Kaiser, even though there may be some evidence that something is valuable to the patient, but it's perhaps not something that's been traditionally covered, and there is a current example. Some of you may know there's a hearing aid type device that can be anchored to, molded to your teeth, and instead of a bone anchor, I think it's called the Sonobite or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's quite expensive, and it involves dental modeling and all this other stuff. And we have a lot of members asking for it, and yet, we can correct their hearing with alternative devices, and we really can't be the only program that's covering something like that and providing it to our members without sustaining a lot of adverse selection and a tremendous impact to the organization. So we're kind of caught there. It does look like a really nice thing to do, but with the adverse selection risk, we really are, we've got physicians who are saying that we have to wait for CMS or somebody else to say that this is going to be covered before we do.
Yeah. Judy, what type of metrics is iRhythm collecting, and how are you generating reimbursement value from that perspective?
Great question. I mean, one of the things, coming back to our life cycle as an organization and how we really looked at where did we need to go first. Just to give you some background, iRhythm came from Stanford's biodesign program, so yeah, everybody here from biodesign. But so we've commercialized that concept, and it started in 2007. And so we really started our first commercial patient in 2010 and onward, and now we're at about 150,000 patients that we've actually taken care of. So the focus that we had on the reimbursement side was first going after Medicare and getting Medicare to embrace it. But what we did up front was to really focus on bringing in consultants, because again, where we were in our life cycle, to help us approach the professional societies. And what happened then is the professional societies actually advocated to the AMA and got us T codes. So we are now operating under T codes. So again, coming back to the metrics point, we provide a tremendous amount of data. Every one of our reports, we actually move into a data warehouse, and we'll talk a little bit more later in the panel, but we are routinely providing information back about the performance of each of our tests. Kaiser also has a national contract with iRhythm. We provide data back per location about the performance of how well did the device perform, how well what were the clinical findings, and we provide that to the physician leadership so that they know exactly what's going on. And I think that's been something that has been very valuable as we've gone into other payers, not using the Kaiser data, but going in and showing them in their own markets and the areas that they cover what is happening with this, what are the types of things that we're finding, and what can they do about that and help manage that. Coming back to a little bit, I think, what Propeller is doing also.
Right. Dr. Hyatt, you mentioned about Kaiser looking at evidence beyond reduced cost. For folks out there, is the healthcare system ready for economic models beyond these metrics of cost savings and looking at more qualitative metrics?
So I'm going to change qualitative to quality. and quality in our definition is really much broader than the patient experience outcome. It's beyond length of stay or return to work date, that sort of thing. It could be the patient safety. It could be efficiency in how we take care of people so we can take care of more people with the same resources. It can be sometimes we will adopt a technology because we need to for physician recruitment and retention. An example of that would be the Da Vinci robot. When we initially deployed that, there at that time was really not good data showing that in fact the operation was any different than competent urologic surgeons with good laparoscopic skills doing the identical operation without the robot for $2,000 less in instruments alone for each case. And since we do over 1,000 prostatectomies just in Southern California each year, that was real money. So we do look at a lot of things beyond just the cost of the device. I think that production of the evidence, the burden of proof for us is really on the quality component and far less on the cost.
So Judy and Diane, I know you're both in the field, and in particular, Judy, from your commercial perspective, have you seen payers interested in quality metrics in your own experiences with iRhythm?
Absolutely. I think to be able to change the difference in dialogue with them and talking about quality metrics, they also really want to know about cost. And I was kind of chuckling this morning. We were, if you look at our life cycle, we went to market as meeting an unmet clinical need. That's what we went to market with in 2007 and out there in 2009. And now the world has changed in, I think, we were talking 15 years, 10 years, 5 years. I mean, to me, it's in 3 years. But that it really is now both the quality, they want to know that, is this going to change a physician's practice? And what is that change going to result in? What is that economic downstream? And that's what, again, we're struggling to try to catch up as fast as we can. We've got clinical validity. Now we need to demonstrate clinical utility. And those take time. I think all of us are aware. At lunch we were speaking about, those takes time when you're trying to look at a study that may 2 years to complete, another year to get into the literature. And you're running fast. How do you really get it all done and get them the proof that they want, which is challenging.
Yeah. And Diane, from an operational perspective, what should folks consider now in commercial planning, particularly from a reimbursement perspective?
I think you have to think about sort of you have to know the landscape a little bit and sort of how risk and how reimbursement is changing. I think that's really important. And if you don't have that resident in your organization, particularly early stage, I think it is good to hire a consultant or bring some expertise on board to just educate folks about that landscape and to be thinking about where you're going to focus. I think there are lots of avenues depending on, all of our products are a little different. So I think there are different avenues for some of our products. But in many cases, for example, in our case, we could have gone direct to consumer. We could sell over the counter and pursue OTC clearance. We could focus on employers and say for all the folks in your organization with asthma, we can focus on payers, we can focus on health systems. And so I think you have to be thoughtful about where the money is, where the clinical interest is, a sense of how that's shifting. I think you have to be incredibly flexible. For example, I think longer term we will be selling mostly to health systems at risk, but we're in a mode of transition now, so we do sell to payers as well. And I think you've got to sort of say, where are we going to pick some places and sort of go for it and understand what the indications are that suggest you got to change your course a little bit. I think, like all of us as early companies, with the types of timeframes we're looking at, sales cycles can be fairly long in healthcare, and there's always lots of impatience among founders and boards. But you got to manage against that to say, I'm not likely to sell this in 30 days to someone because I had a meeting. But what is the point at which you say, going to a payer isn't really going to be my primary market today? So I think there's lots of experimentation you'll do, but understanding your own internal metrics to suggest when it's time to think a little differently.
I would also add to Diane's comments that, again, one of the recommendations if I was starting a new business, I would say my reimbursement consultant, my reimbursement expertise, that's going to be one of my first hires. Because if we don't figure it out early, it is so hard to catch it up. And really, you'll burn a lot of money, which is not what anybody wants to do. We want to spend wisely. So to me, it's a lesson learned. I would just, this is my 4th startup, so I've learned a lot along the way, and so I'm always want to transfer that knowledge. So go early with reimbursement support.
So I think that's true, and I don't this is the first medical technology company I've worked for. So to me, I had no understanding of FDA processes and clearance. So when I first came on board, they were like, well, we have such a huge competitive advantage, we're FDA cleared, and I sort of thought, well, who cares? Are you going to save money? So I understand it. It's a checkbox, right? It's the price of entry. So I don't mean to sort of suggest it's not a huge accomplishment, but it's a price of entry. But that doesn't mean you'll succeed or have a big market, and so that I think is sometimes a shift in thinking and knowing that earlier than historic companies may have.
Agreed. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. There's a lot of buzz about digital healthcare and big data, clearly an emerging and undefined sector in our space. For folks in the audience, again, by a show of hands, do you think med device companies are best positioned to drive this digital health transformation? Wow. Wow, then I guess my next question is, more importantly, do you think such businesses will work? Yes. And so why don't we have hands earlier on?
Yeah.
Judy, in your opinion, what is the role of med device in digital healthcare, and how does it create value?
Well, I, really look at, okay, so I showed you the bright, shiny object. Ooh, everybody likes this. But what I really know is most important as a clinician, as a business person, is what it creates, is the data. This gets me in the door. These results make the physicians' lives easier, gets the patients diagnosed better, makes the patient satisfaction better. But what's more important in my mind is what the data that you're collecting. What does that look like? Can you partner together with a payer to really try to understand, can you stop layering of tests? And again, I know we're all interested in economic data, but to me, that's to own the data that you're creating and to really take that and drive that so that you, again, don't have somebody else doing it for you, that you own that and that you put the resources in to really creating that data warehouse and the folks who really can spend time thinking about, well, what is this? What do we see? I had a pharmaceutical company come to me and say, could you tell me the pattern of atrial fibrillation and what's happening day to day with AFib? And I said, yeah, absolutely, yes, I can. Now I'm trying to monetize that, and so we've been talking about what does that look like, because they would love to get their hands on that. Again, so it's how do we really take what we're creating from a data and an experience perspective and really translate it into value? And it's challenging, but stay tuned for hopefully next year I can come back and tell you what we've done. So.
Well, Diane, on that note, are you selling the technology or the service, or can it be both?
That's a great question. And I'm very biased given my own experience, so I'm going to put that out there. And I come from service environments, even, sort of at Athena Health, we were a service company selling software with, service components. And, I think it does depend on what you're doing. So in some cases, it may be technology and you provide it to a clinician or et cetera. But I think in a lot of our cases, we really have to be thinking about ourselves as services. Because again, unless someone uses it, unless a consumer picks it up and cares, unless, you can provide something, even, this is pretty simple, right? You put an adhesive cap on and you push but you send people a kit at home because they say they're going to use it and their payer is paying for it. And then initially we were a little shocked, well, where's the activation? They've got an online account, they went through the trouble. But, this can be, for a busy mom who's got kids, like if it isn't a 2-second thing, it isn't obvious. So I think we really have to think about how we support people, whether that's, MAs in physician's office who are supporting the physicians or the patients, and what are the complementary services for different types of populations. And some of that we'll learn from and automate over time. So we have an asthma nurse educator on our team, though we're medical device and mobile health and website. And over time, we'll automate the use of that to say, where is that actually strategic to place a call and where is it cost effective? Because you can't do it to everybody. But I think you have to think about how do you move people up a curve, whether that's, nurses or case managers or patients, so that you're supporting them towards your technology as opposed to assuming, like a lot of us internally, it's so cool, it's intuitive, so I think it's important to think about it as a service, depending on what you're doing.
And Dr. Hyatt, will adding new services or big data to MedTech be valued by providers and payers alike?
Well, absolutely, if we can turn it into actionable information. The challenge, I think, is that we're just overwhelmed with data, but we aren't sure what to do with it. And we know that the tsunami of the genome sequencing information, potentially people walking in saying, well, I got my 23andMe and it says that I'm at risk for whatever. We're not sure what to do with all of that information. And on the device and equipment side, there's a ton of data that's accumulated that isn't made available to us. So an example is that we spend a lot of money on very sophisticated angiography imaging equipment with all sorts of elegant packages for 3D reconstruction and other things. And the vendor knows because they actually have connectivity to this equipment so that they can monitor it and make sure that it's functioning reasonably well. They know whether those software packages are actually being utilized. They know whether technicians are changing established protocols to other things that might not be as safe. We don't have access to that information as the user, which is really kind of silly. So we've wasted the money on software we're not using, or maybe it actually isn't needed and we wasted the money buying it. It's one or the other. It's not that it's a good idea to spend the money and then not use it. I think everybody's clear on that. And so I think there is an awful lot of information. Obviously, people have incredibly sophisticated devices in their pockets now that we theoretically could get a lot of helpful information from. And then the other thing that we're just ramping up to deal with, that many of you may know about, the USPSTF is going to finalize its recommendation in a couple of weeks for the lung cancer screening recommendation for people with 30-plus pack-year smoking history, et cetera, to be screened annually with low-dose CT. Well, the trial was stopped early. We don't know, do you screen just for 3 years and then what? Do you screen every year for how long? And in those 3 years that the study ran, about 40% of people had something found, and a lot of biopsies, a lot of additional workup, most of which was not lung cancer. How much of that can we really learn from? And so just for order of scale, the study was done with 25,000 or so people in the CT group, and we've run the numbers on our population. We're going to have over 300,000 members that qualify for annual screening, and we have the potential, if we had the tools to really analyze the data that's embedded in those images. Those are all digital studies, and with computer-assisted detection or other things, we could, in theory, learn a whole lot about who really does need these scans, who really does need the follow-up, what deserves a biopsy. We're kind of just doing this blind right now, and it's a waste of a lot of data.
Well, I think on that front, it'd be kind of interesting for folks to hear about, especially, how can they better engage with folks at Kaiser or other providers, and, and what's the avenue for that, so there's, there can be this exchange.
So there are multiple avenues. Many of you know first of all, we do have a venture investment fund. We're nowhere near the scale of many of the VCs in this room. We're tiny, but we do invest in startups that are developing technologies that we think are going to benefit our members or our providers or facilities. So that's one avenue, and they have a public website. We have a procurement and supply department that also is accessible on our public website for various devices in categories. So we have a director of orthopedic devices, for example, cardiology, et cetera. So that's another path. Our physicians, we have over 16,000 physicians, and they are regular participants in professional societies and go to the various educational and other events where there's interaction there. There are lots of different ways.
So Judy, clearly, I think I read on your website, your patch in 14 days captures, 1.5 million heartbeats?
Oh,
yeah, that's a lot of data.
We get it
So how has iRhythm addressed the concern about too much data?
Yeah. That's a great question. And when I first came on board with iRhythm, I was like, how am I going to present this? How am I going to make it actionable for a physician? And so what we did is we spent a lot of time talking with physicians and asking, an EP physician wants everything, and they want all of it. The ED physician, who may see the same test, is like, just make it really easy for me. So that's what we did. We actually created something that, again, I'm sorry we don't have bigger pictures, but it's an executive summary. And so a primary care or an ED physician interacts with the data. If he doesn't see anything in these blue boxes, he's home free. He or she, is home free. If there is data, so ECGs showing up here, they know that they need to drive into the report to get more and more information. And so that we've then graphically given a view of what's gone on over every 14 days in 20-minute increments. So we've really redesigned the way that the physician is presenting the data, and then we pull out those pieces of information that are most important, that are clinically most relevant. And from there, we then also have a way that we triage the data for the physicians to say, this is the one that you need to know about, and we'll push out a message to say to them, gosh, you need to pay attention to this, because we know that your day is overloaded with data. We know that we need to help prioritize that. So whilst, and that's really been a system that's worked and seemed to work well. And we run about 8% of our records actually where we're notifying a physician of the data. And again, keep in mind, this is all retrospective. But again, the value of it is being able to see over time what happens. What's the pattern and characteristic of what's going on? And so I think we've really, at this point, spent a lot of time designing and really creating a tool that physicians interact with really well.
Great. And Dr. Hyatt?
I just want to make a quick comment because Judy a couple of times has mentioned time. And there have been studies, it's really rather depressing. Even when there's extremely good evidence that a clinical practice has benefit, the average time for it to become reasonably pervasive is 17 years. So it's really depressing. And so just so you know, even if you do everything right, your timeline to actually really penetrate and have it be standard practice is not short.
I have actually an interesting story about data, and it was the first time I was a little shocked, but it was actually a large health system, and there are always clinicians involved to sort of vet what you're doing. And there was an interesting question by a clinician to say, what's the risk of liability here for? Does this increase our liability? So for example, suppose, we're, quote, leveraging you for COPD, and we're getting, indication that someone is using their rescue inhaler and really declining, and you're giving us that notification. Even if it's just give me the exception data, I don't want to see it all. And what if I don't respond? Does that increase my liability? So some concern with I get so much data, and what if it's sitting somewhere for me, and I or my team didn't address it? Wouldn't that be used against me in a lawsuit? So there is all this issue about how much data, is it good or bad? And I was a little shocked, right? But this is going to help you help the patient, but lots of questions.
Clearly. So we have a couple of minutes left, and so we're open to take some questions from the audience.
You guys got it all?
I think we have a question in the back.
It seems like the beauty of the monitoring devices that you have are their short-term. A lot of us have devices that give us the long-term data. The service burden associated with the long-term device is just astronomical.
Yeah.
And so I think I'd like to hear you maybe hum a few bars on where that sweet spot is of service burden associated with the 2-week monitoring, 2-month monitoring, 2-year monitoring. Tell us where that payoff would be. From the perspective of the company investing in it, we can sell a $20,000 device, but we're supporting that device for 7 years, and our profitability goes down disproportionately, even though we got that $20,000 from the beginning.
Right. I mean, I think in terms of services, and I don't know specifically what you're doing, so it's hard for me to just sort of make up, an answer without sort of visualizing and thinking about it. But I think there's services and services, and services can be highly automated. So part of it is how do you create something that feels, it depends what you're doing. Like for us, how do we enable the patients to feel highly supported and very personalized in messages, et cetera, where there may not be any human touch. So I think, and often we hear too investors concerned about services and staff and scalability and cost, et cetera. So I do think you have to be incredibly thoughtful because it can just kill your profitability. But I think it's learning and maybe spending some time and energy and money up front. So we're heavier-handed today than we ever will be to sort of understand how you can automate and how you can provide minimal service that feels like it's heavier than potentially it is. But it sort of depends on what your business is, I think.
I would agree. I think for us, it's a continuous investment in technology to help us reduce the human touch. And that is what I spend my life in, is just what can I do to get better, to process better, faster, get the algorithms tweaked. So I understand, yes, I don't have a burden of 7 years, but I have to be able to scale this. And so to me, that's where I spend a lot of my time, is really looking and thinking through, how do I make this faster? How do I do this with less? Which I think where you're really, how can I automate a lot of this? So.
And I think part of the challenge is that we don't know yet whether that 2-week monitoring period is enough. If that's going to pick up 99% of the pathology that we would actually intervene for, and if you monitor for 2 years and you're only picking up a tiny amount of additional important disease or pathology, that's probably not a way to go in this particular technology. And that's the challenge we're having right now, because I know there is interest in looking for occult sources of strokes with long-term monitoring, but we have no idea, based on any literature we've been able to find, that going beyond 2 weeks actually finds anything.
Great. Well, is there any more questions? I'd like to thank the panel so much. Thank you.